Hey everyone, I'm Selena Hill, and this is the new norm on Black Enterprise. On today's episode, I have the privilege to speak with activist, community organizer, and attorney Leslie E. Redmond, who made history as the youngest person to serve as president of the Minneapolis NAACP at the age of 25. Leslie is also the founder of Don't Complain, Activate. Leslie, thank you so much for joining me here on Black Enterprise today.
Hi, Selena. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course. So you've been really busy. We're gearing up for the commemoration of the 5th year anniversary of the brutal police murder of George Floyd. And you're actually leading organizing efforts around what is the second day of remembrance in Minnesota. Leslie, why is it important for us as a nation to commemorate the 5th year anniversary of his murder?
So, what we don't remember, we repeat, right? And right now, during a cycle or season in time where people are trying to rewrite history, where they are trying to make us forget, where they're almost attempting to ask us to unsee what we all witnessed and what we saw, right? And Brother George Floyd, and unfortunately his murder was such a key component of people really opening their eyes and seeing America for what it was worth, right? On May 25th, 2020, in the midst of a global pandemic. I often say that even a global pandemic couldn't stop white supremacy, right? And so even in the midst when people are supposed to be on shutdown and in the house, an unarmed Black man, Brother George Floyd, was murdered. And we saw Derek Chauvin kneel on his neck and take his life, and none of the other officers intervened. And so it's so important for people to remember that moment. Never forget, when there's so much going on right now and they're throwing everything at us, every different direction, it's to cause confusion and chaos, right? And so for us, it's very important to remember. My nonprofit started doing this Day of Remembrance last year. And a lot of people say, well, Leslie, why are you doing a 4 year? And because for me, it's every year we should be remembering, right? And shout out to everyone in Minnesota who has been keeping George Floyd's name alive. And Selena, one of the things was I went over to Geneva, Switzerland, and worked with the World Council of Churches on a document to commemorate George Floyd and the role that religion plays in their complicity with racism. Anytime I'm in my native hometown of Washington, D.C., everyone's talking about George Floyd. You almost can't look at a book or hear anyone's story without them talking about the impact of Brother George Floyd and his murder. However, in Minnesota, there felt like there was this underlying attempt to forget, right? To stop talking about it. And so, while the world might have been shocked earlier this year about the Target scandal and everything that has happened, I actually wasn't surprised, because this has actually been building for quite a while now, where people are forgetting the commitments that they've made. They're forgetting what we all witnessed in 2020. And there's this desire to go backwards.
Leslie, you mentioned something very important. You said the church has been complicit in white supremacy and anti-Black racism, and you've been working internationally to get the church more involved. Talk about that and just what you're seeing when it comes to, again, just religious leaders, especially those that are not Black. Are they speaking up? What could and should they be doing more of?
Yeah, so one of the things that I love to quote both Malcolm and Martin, we know they didn't always agree, but one of the things that they agreed of is that one of the most divided times in America is, I believe they said 11 a.m. on a Sunday, right? During that time, we see white people gathering in one location and we see Black people gathering in another location. And the Bible is very specific, and I would argue probably all religions would agree on this. We are supposed to help oppressed populations of people. We are supposed to speak truth to power. I often tell people even Jesus was flipping tables, right? And so I was so thankful when the World Council of Churches, they reached out to the Minnesota Council of Churches in Minnesota, who I work very closely with every year as a part of the Remembrance. And even before I started doing the Day of Remembrances, I started organizing these interfaith prayers where we have imams and bishops and pastors and rabbis and just everyone from different religious groups come together, because this is not a political or religious divide. Anyone who believes in humanity should be standing with us, right? And so that's something I'm always echoing.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because, like you said, even in the Bible and Christianity, Jesus stood up. God talks about oppression all the time. It is a reoccurring theme. I mean, if you ask me, Jesus was a socialist, but that's another conversation for another day. But, I would believe that if Christ was here in these times, he'd be right there with us. But I do want to just get back again to your event, because last year was the first year. So tell us about what happened the first year.
So, one, I love to tell this story. Brandon Williams, which many of you may be familiar with him, he is the nephew of George Floyd. And we actually flew him in from Houston, Texas last year to be a part of the day. And one of the things that he said is, it's very hard for him to come back to Minnesota. While George Floyd is a figure for many of us in history, this was his uncle, right, who he grew up with. And he said, despite it being challenging and very traumatic, he said the Day of Remembrance was a day of joy. Right. And that was really important to me. I remember when they did the Till movie about Emmett Till, the director or producer said, we're going to start and end this film with joy. And that's how I look at the Day of Remembrance. We really start the Day of Remembrance and end the Day of Remembrance with joy. And so last year and this year kind of has a similar format. We start off in the morning with the interfaith prayer in City Hall, where there are a lot of policies and decisions made. And as I mentioned, there are rabbis and imams and bishops and pastors and different faith religions coming together as one. And then we have a remembrance brunch, which is a ticketed and closed event, our only closed event. Last year it hosted almost 300 people. This year will host 400 people. And we have a number of sponsors. Shout out to some of you will probably be familiar with like U.S. Bank and their Best Buy. And there are a lot of foundations in Minnesota that understand the importance of this work and support it. Last year during the panel conversation, we had Attorney General Keith Ellison, which many of you remember he was responsible for prosecuting Derek Chauvin. We had Chief Arredondo was the first Black police chief in Minneapolis, and he fired all 4 officers and actually even testified against Derek Chauvin. We had Nakima Levy Armstrong, who was my law professor. She was also the head of the Minneapolis NAACP and really one of the champions around this Target boycott. We also had Tashir Garraway, who was over family supporting families against police violence. And also she lost her fiance, Justin, to police brutality. And last but certainly not least, Doug Baker, who was the head of Eco Lab and who sits on several boards in Minnesota, Target being one of them. But he sits on several boards and really has been a really important voice in the business community. And so what I wanted to do last year was to hear the various different perspectives from different industry leaders. And then we also gave out scholarships to 4 deserving young people, one in the name of George Floyd, another in the name of Darnella Frazier, which you all are familiar with. Darnella was the young Black girl who recorded the George Floyd being murdered, the teenager who just an incredible force. We named one after her, and then the other 2 after elders in the community. And so it's an opportunity to celebrate our elders and honor our elders while also celebrating and providing economic support to young people as well. And then we had some performances, and then we went over to Sabathani Community Center last year for a youth summit. This year, after the brunch, we're going to go over to George Floyd Square for a moment of silence and lay down roses. And then we're having an evening event at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Some of you may have seen Alicia Keys and Swiss Beats were just there because they have a Giants exhibit at the Minneapolis Institute of Art right now. We are hosting an event at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Well-known actor and singer Tristan Wiles is coming to be a part of that conversation, and some other amazing artists, Philly Irving, Tish Jones, and Maya Marshall. And going back for a second, the panel this year, dynamic panel, starting off with Miss Valerie Castile, who was the mother of Philando Castile, which you all remember when Philando was murdered July of 2016 in St. Paul, Minnesota. And, you know, Miss Valerie is just an amazing force who's continued the good work. So she'll be on the panel. Adair Mosby, who is over the African American Leadership Forum in Minnesota. Kenny McKnight, who's over Black Women Wealth Alliance and the Zara. Adam Dunnick, who is over the Minneapolis Business Council. And finally, the moderator is Kevin Lindsay, who's also an attorney. He used to be the Commissioner of Human Rights in Minnesota, and now he is the CEO for Minnesota Humanities Center.
So, very active day. What's the date for that event?
This is Friday, May 23rd. We always host it the
May 23rd.
Friday before the actual anniversary.
Okay.
George Floyd's Remembrance is on, his actual Remembrance is Sunday, May 25th, but we always host it the Friday before.
And I want to take it back to May 25th, 2020, because at that time, Leslie, you were serving as president of the Minneapolis NAACP. What changes in police reform have you seen since George Floyd was murdered, and what changes have yet to be made that we need?
Well, we know on the national level, the George Floyd Policing Act was never passed, which is so unfortunate because you all would think that that could be something that we could all get behind and move forward. What I can say on a positive note, in Minnesota, there's been a series of legislation that has been pushed forward to address police brutality, data and documentation. There's been a lot that's been pushed on a local level, even as far as Minnesota being the first state to start. They have a missing and murdered Black women council that currently now exists. And again, that's been since the murder of George Floyd. Also, you all may remember that Amir Locke was murdered February 2nd, 2022. That was a no-knock warrant. Right, that happened. And so there's been a lot of push and changes around that. Also thinking back to 2020, I was leading the Minneapolis NAACP, but I also went to Louisville, Kentucky and got arrested for protesting on Daniel Cameron's lawn. And I'll never forget saying we got arrested before the officers who were involved in the killing of Breonna Taylor. And I often say as well, had we addressed it in 2020, maybe Amir Locke wouldn't have been murdered in 2022. And so something that I'm constantly saying is we have to get this right because all of our lives are at stake. Too often people won't become involved in a fight until it's their relative, until it's their family member. And I need us all to get activated. Even when you think again back to 2020, we couldn't even get through with Derek Chauvin's trial before Daunte Wright was murdered in April of 2021, right? And so it's just been trauma on top of trauma. One of the things I often say as well is Black people, and not just Black people, but anyone that cares about humanity, can't get past the past because it's still existing currently in the future. And so while there has been legislation that's been passed, even when Chief Arredondo was still the chief because he's since retired, I actually administered the oath of office. They redid the oath of office for the first time in like decades, really talking about the duty of officers to intervene when they see other officers poorly acting. And while people might not always understand the significance of it, language matters, right? It's very important, these oath of offices, this legislation, this policy. And so it's something that I often tell people, again, don't complain, activate, that we can't all do everything, but we can all do something. And so we need to get activated in one capacity or another.
Leslie, can you talk about the role of Black Lives Matter during this time? You know, 2020, there were international global protests. Black Lives Matter was not only an organization, but it was a movement. But now we look back 5 years and a lot of folks say, what effects did it really have? What gains have we really made when it comes to racial justice in America? And I wanted to, ask that question to you. Like, do you think Black Lives Matter has been effective in the fight towards racial justice?
100%. I often tell people, while I was never associated with Black Lives Matter, the organization, to me, Black Lives Matter was a movement. right, for everyone. And I think that was one of the most powerful things about it, was that it wasn't centralized. I heard a pastor recently say Black Lives Matter was the first movement that didn't get its inception in the church. And while I'm a believer, I love the Lord, I think the church plays a vital role. We know that the church also has caused a lot of hurt and harm to the community, and has also been complicit and silent in a number of things. And so the fact that it wasn't centralized in the church, I actually thought was powerful. It wasn't centralized anywhere. Everyone felt connected to Black Lives Matter. I still feel like to this day it has played an important role. And as someone who lived in Florida and was going to school in Miami when Trayvon Martin was murdered, I really understand the significant impacts of Black Lives Matter, because during that time, a lot of people were telling us to get out of the street. And it wasn't just white people. There were Black people saying, we need to get out of the street. That was during the time where people were still saying you shouldn't be wearing a hoodie, right? This was during the time where people were still vilifying the victims, right? And then you had Mike Brown and Ferguson, and then you had several different others come after it. But to me, the social awareness that Black Lives Matter brought, right? The intentionality to say, actually, our Black lives do matter. And it doesn't matter if I'm wearing a hoodie. It doesn't matter what the circumstances are around it. I deserve to live. And it was something that we could all get behind. That to me was very important, and something that I don't know we've seen anything quite like it since then.
I agree. I did a podcast and the question came on, was Black Lives Matter performative? Did it accomplish real change? But to your point, Leslie, I 100% agree that it raised international awareness about police reform in Black communities and just the brutality and violence that we've been subjected to. And that in itself, just to have people talking. But how do we continue to keep this issue at the forefront, especially when there's so many other things going on? Like we see what's happening to our undocumented brothers and sisters. We see the attack on DEI. There's just so much going on. We see the economy. How do we keep this issue at the forefront?
100%. I would tell people, don't try to do everything. Amen. Like me. Back in the day, I wanted to do everything, be everywhere, be everything to everyone. We'll burn ourselves out that way. I wouldn't say do everything, but try to do something. Pick an area, pick an issue, whether it's education, whether it's criminal justice. Pick an issue, focus in on that. Get a group of people that are passionate about the issue just like you. Start organizing, get involved in an organization. One of the things that we're going to be doing in Minneapolis is Saturday morning activations where we're getting the community together. We're talking about these issues and figuring out how we move forward collectively. And then we're going to do a fall follow-up in August, because to your point, we have to get organized. We have to start having conversations, and we really have to build our base, right? We have to build our base. We have to start getting on the same page, and we have to work together.
100%. I do want to shift gears a little bit, because just to bring it back to Derek Chauvin, again, he was the police officer that has been convicted and sentenced to, I believe, 22 years in prison for murdering George Floyd. But there is a petition being led to get him pardoned. Conservative commentator Ben Shapiro is petitioning Donald Trump to get him pardoned. What's your reaction to that?
It's disheartening, but to go back to what I said at the beginning of this interview, what we don't remember, we repeat, right? And so we have to be very intentional. We have to be very mindful. And something I would say the other side does very well is we have to be strategic. We have to be strategic and we have to be intentional. I'm very hopeful because there were federal and state charges, right? And so I'm hopeful that Chauvin will stay where he belongs right now. But I do think it's a wake-up call for the rest of us to wake up and to see that they're trying to take us back to the times where Emmett Till can be murdered and no one be held accountable, right? It was a really big deal that Chauvin was held accountable. He was the first officer in modern history, right, to really be held accountable. And actually, I take that back. Officer Noor, when I don't know if y'all remember when the white woman Justine DeMond was murdered in South Minneapolis, he was the first officer. And it wasn't a coincidence that he was a black Somali Muslim man that murdered a white woman, right? So he was the first one. And then Chauvin, 2 years later, was the second one. But even those facts are things that we have to think about and we have to be mindful of, because we live in a in a world where the legislation, where the precedent has been, you go back to Dred Scott, that Black people have no rights that the white man must abide to and must respect, right? And so those are the days that they're trying to take us back to. And this is just what's happening right now with the idea of pardoning Chauvin. When we saw, but also you have to look at like when they did that documentary and came to Minnesota and tried to say, oh no, Chauvin was right and it wasn't, his fault. And so this narrative has been building for quite some time now.
Yep, it sure has. They were saying that it was his death was related to heart disease or something else. And it's like we all saw this man be killed, regardless of whatever was happening. If he wasn't choked to death, he would be alive. So I mean, the evidence is right there, but it just amazes me how forceful and unapologetic white supremacy is. They will stop at no regard. It's like they don't care. They don't care who it is, what it is. They want to uphold again their supremacy. How do we prepare for something like that?
We have to have the same energy. Too often when we get in these positions of power, we dance around with it. We play around with it. We want to be very nice. Now is not the time to be nice. I say you could be kind, but being nice is overrated. We need to be just as passionate. We need to be just as unapologetic about fighting for justice. And too often we're not. To me, I think we play around with it and we don't really understand the urgency. I've been feeling this urgency since birth, Celine. I'm not going to lie, right? I've been feeling it since birth. And again, that's why I was so thankful for Black Lives Matter, because it kind of gave it the urgency that we needed. And then in 2020, there was this great awakening. It was like the veil lifted because everyone was sitting down and was forced to see what was going on. But now they're distracting us again, right? And now we're back hooked on social media and we're not paying attention to what's going on. And we really need to wake up. We need to get strategic. We need to get intentional. I often say it starts in your house. It starts with your family, getting your family organized. Everything's local, right? Don't worry about the president. Worry about the city council. Worry about the school board. Worry about your local representatives. Start there. Build your base there. Figure out what issues are impacting your community the most, that are impacting you the most, and begin at home.
Yep, because all politics are local. And speaking of distractions and just things going on, we see again the attack on DEI. Especially, I want to talk about Target, because Target is headquartered in Minneapolis, not far from where George Floyd was murdered. However, just days after the inauguration of Trump, for which Target donated $1 million, by the way, the retailer dropped its DEI initiatives, and that was seen as an endorsement of Trump's administration's effort to continue to roll back. What is your response to everything Target has been doing right there in your hometown? And when it comes to just sort of playing ping pong, right? Like saying that they were standing up with us in the fight for justice, rolled it back 5 years later, and now, having meetings with Reverend Al Sharpton and Pastor Jamal Bryant.
First, I want to say that while it's disappointing, it's not surprising. And this is why we should listen to local communities and people that are on the ground. I also want to shout out to attorney Nikema Levy Armstrong, who was one of the first organizers in a community of Minnesotans who hosted a press conference at the end of June calling for the boycott of Target and really trying to hold Target accountable really proactively. I can remember Target reached out to me back in 2021, or it might have been the end of 2020. They had like a DC based firm basically asking for insight. And I told them, you all are not really in this fight with us. You pick groups of people that you want to work with, right? And you pour into them. But as a community as a whole, you all are not there. Even when I asked them to be involved in the last year Day of Remembrance, they decided and declined not being involved. I could have told you all, if anybody asked me, if Target was really in this fight for real, they weren't. And a lot of these actions are performative. Even them calling meetings with pastors and faith leaders, it's not a little, it's a lot dismissive. You know what I mean? Of the people in their own backyard that's right there, that's been hosting press conferences right in front of the Target headquarters. Why haven't you called them? It's intentional. There's an eraser that often happens. And Selena, you know this, especially when it's black women at the head, you know, especially when you have black people who have been on the ground speaking truth to power and are not going to sell their community out. Everybody in Minnesota knows that Kimberly Lee Armstrong, not even just in Minnesota, nationally. Oprah interviewed her in 2020, right? They know who is on the ground. They know who is doing the work and who's holding people accountable. And they're intentionally not reaching out to those individuals. And again, this is very Target like. You know, I've had conversations before and after the situation with Target and told them, you all have to engage the community. It can't just be the black brands who have a stake in your business. It can't just be these faith leaders who are not even from Minnesota and don't even have the real landscape and understanding really of how deep this goes. When you talk about Target, you have to talk about the surveillance that they do. You have to, like, it's so many different layers to Target, right? And how they really never stood with our community, and what they did in 2020 was performative. And I would also say it's not just Target, right? Target is a starting point. It's one of the many businesses who made granular, and I often tell people, Selena, you have to be careful when people are moving based on fear. So in 2020, it was moving on fear because George Floyd was murdered and buildings were burning, including Target. Now in 2025, you're moving on fear because President Trump is back in office. When people move based on fear, you have to be very cautious because it's not coming from an authentic place, Selena.
That's a good point, Leslie. Is there any way that Target could be redeemed?
Everybody's not going to agree with me. I'm a person that believes in redemption. You know, like, I just have to say that. That's just true to who I truly am. You know, back in 2020, during the time that Brother George Floyd was murdered, we were also fighting for Mayan Burrell, who had been wrongfully convicted, to come home. And Amy Klobuchar, Senator Amy Klobuchar, was the leading prosecutor at the time that prosecuted him. Myself, Nikema Levy Armstrong, and family went and met with her. And I told her there's always redemption. Like, to me, you can't say there's redemption for people with criminal records and X, Y, and Z and not say there's redemption for everyone, right? And so I'm very consistent on redemption, but it has to be authentic. Amy Klobuchar had to come out and publicly say, hey, we need to look back into this case. Hey, we need to do right? It can't just be these private conversations behind closed doors. And it can be private conversations with people who are not even impacted directly on the ground and who really are going to hold you accountable.
Leslie, I want, just to wrap here, tell us again about the Day of Remembrance, how we can support it. And for those of us who are not in Minnesota, what could and should we be doing to just keep the mission and the message alive?
So for those of you who are going to miss this year, I invite you to come out next year. Okay, we already have the date. So this year is Friday, May 23rd. Next year is going to be Friday, May 22nd. It's very simple because it's always a Friday before the actual remembrance of George Floyd. I do think it's important for people to come back and touch the soul of where George Floyd was murdered and support local communities in Minnesota, right? I think that that's really important. The Day of Remembrance, again, is going to be hosted on Friday, May 23rd. I really encourage you all to follow us on social media. My Instagram is Leslie E. Redmond. Our nonprofit Instagram is Win Back Nonprofit on Instagram. We're going to be going live. We're going to be supporting that way. And again, if you can't come this year, I really encourage you all to make your way to Minneapolis for 2026, because while everybody's going to have their eyes on Minnesota for the 5-year remembrance, it doesn't stop here, right? Like, Selena, we cannot forget. And we can't go back to sleep after the 5-year remembrance. This has to be an ongoing commitment. And so I would even say it's even better for you all to come in 2026, right? And be on the ground with us, really supporting local communities.
And I love how you say, Leslie, what we don't remember, we repeat. And I don't want no one wants another travesty like this. I mean, we see police violence every single day in this country. It just so happened that this one was filmed and escalated to an international level. But it shouldn't have to take that for us to advocate for change and for people in power to actually make the change. So yes.
I was going to say, in Minnesota, I often hear people say, no one thought the revolution would start in Minnesota except for Prince. right? And I think it's really important to recognize the patterns, right, of Philando Castile in 2016 that everyone was outraged about, George Floyd in 2020, and now Target that's headquartered in Minnesota really being at the nucleus. Minnesota is a divine place. You know, I don't know what God has in store, but I would tell people connect with the local grassroots people who are on the ground doing the work in Minnesota, because this is not the last time you all are going to see Minnesota in the headlines, unfortunately. Kind of like Mississippi has a name in the South, Minnesota has a name in the Midwest.
Absolutely. Leslie, thank you so much for your time today and the work you are doing in your community as well as in the nation at large, continuing to fight for freedom, civil liberties, rights, and just the end of anti-Black racism. We need it, sis, and we support you. And, you know, just keep doing it. Just continue to stay encouraged. I know it's hard, but keep doing it.